from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the sixth program that we are calling Journey Through Time, What Happened in the Western World in the Second Millennium. On today's program, we're going to be talking about the world of democracy, and our guest is Dr. Clay Jenkinson, who is really, I believe, the most renowned Chautauqua performer in the entire movement. He has been with us, fortunately, over the last 4 years as we've dealt with Journey Through Time, and this year, as I've indicated, it is about the second millennium. Dr. Jenkinson is also known for a number of other characters, and in addition to that, he has been recognized with many awards for his work, such as President George Bush awarded to him or presented to him the Charles Franklin Prize, which is the National Endowment for the Humanities' most high award. Our guest is a Rhodes Scholar. He was at Oxford, and he received his degree in Renaissance English, Literature, and Theology. But he's here today as Thomas Jefferson, so we welcome all of you to the program for a half-hour's conversation with Thomas Jefferson, who lived from 1743 to 1826. Thomas Jefferson was the governor of Virginia. He was the United States minister to France. He was the vice president of the United States under John Adams, and he served as president of the United States from 1801 until 1809. He was so well known as the author of the Declaration of Independence and also the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. President Jefferson was very proud of the fact that he also was the father of the University of Virginia. President Jefferson, it's a pleasure to welcome you to 1999, and what an honor for this program to have you in our presence.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have two regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her, Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President for College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And we shall invite Janelle Burke to start the questioning with President Thomas Jefferson.
In our time, it's very important to have the right to vote. In your time, was there a lot of discussion about who was going to have the right to vote? Or was there rather a discussion about general philosophies of freedom more than there was an attachment to that right to vote?
Oh, our first interest was getting rid of the British tyrant and being an independent sovereign nation. Once we were fully independent, we had to decide what sort of a constitution we would create, both in states like Virginia and for the nation, for the United States. Frankly, we didn't think greatly about the franchise, and by your standards, the franchise was decidedly narrow. It really meant adult white males free of a certain property qualification. I was the first American to promote universal manhood suffrage for white males. That was considered too radical in my time. So women didn't vote, except in some very isolated pockets. Black people did not vote. They were slaves and considered property. Indians didn't vote. They were foreign nations. And most poor white males did not vote. And we didn't have a lively debate about this. That all came later.
Now, you did have quite a few discussions, though, with other Virginia gentlemen. There were a number of you who lived almost in the same area. Who were those important persons to you? I think you probably had a number of discussions with James Madison, who lived not far from you.
He lived 30 miles away at Montpelier. I actually tried to get all of my closest friends and protégés to live with me at my mountain at Monticello. I offered them small plots of ground nearby so that they could build their own estates. The only one who ever really did was James Monroe. He lived just on the next mountain. But I wanted William Short, my protégé, to live there, Philip Mazzi, the Italian vigneron, to live there. I even invited Mrs. Cosway, the European beauty that I was in love with, to come stay near Monticello. But most of them kept their distance for one reason or another. But my closest political ally through my entire life was James Madison. It was about a day's carriage ride between our two estates, and we discussed almost everything in the course of our lives. Probably I spent more time theorizing about what a republic could be with him than with any other individual.
Steve Schenck. Mr. President, it's a pleasure to have you back with us again.
Thank you.
Thanks to Janelle's questions, you've shared with us some things about your personal life, and I think that is a rare opportunity to have a distinguished public figure here and learn more about his background, his daily habits, his interests. Could you tell us what a typical day is like for you?
Let me say, first of all, I'm a little uncomfortable talking about my private life because in my era we kept a wall of separation between our public lives and our private ones, but your question is so respectful that I will try to answer it with candor. I rose before the sun every day. I never slept in after sunrise. I then bathed my feet in cold water. This was an 18th century fad, and it was intended to stave off colds and fevers. Then I went to my writing desk and worked for 2 or 3 or 4 hours. I had a very voluminous correspondence. Then I would take a break for a bit of breakfast, perhaps a cup of coffee and a biscuit or a roll of some sort. I would work again until noon or 1 or maybe 2 p.m. Then I invariably took exercise. As a young man, I ran or walked. As an adult, I rode my horses, but never a day went by without my spending some time under the sky. At 3 or so, or maybe 4 o'clock, depending upon the season, we would have our main meal of the day. That was often attended by as many as 50 people. We were pressed by visitors throughout my retirement especially. And then there would be more private time. Tea would be at about dusk. Afterwards, I would go alone into my suite of rooms, my study, and read for the remainder of the evening or perhaps work on a project of some sort. And just before I went to bed, usually around 10 p.m., I would read something of a moral nature, Epictetus or Epicurus or possibly a passage from the Bible, so that during the intervals of sleep I would have something to ruminate on in the night. And then the next day I would begin this process again. The only thing I can add to that is that I kept 5 daily diaries every day of my life.
Mr. President, if I may, and this is less personal, I think, or at least I intend it to be, you lived such a full life, did so many things. And aside, I'm not talking now about accomplishment so much as the things that gave you the most pleasure. Of all the things you did in your life, what did you enjoy the most?
Well, I think I would say supervising the upbringing of my grandchildren. I had 12 grandchildren. My daughter Martha had 11 surviving children, and my daughter Maria had 1. And my happiest days were when I was at Monticello, surrounded by love, by family, by books, by the gardens and my many pursuits. But in the late afternoon, I would often have a little seminar in my study in which every child would take up a book and read for 30 minutes, and then I would interview each one and ask what he, or in some cases she, had been reading. That gave me enormous pleasure. But I loved many things about daily life. I said I could not live without books. I could not live without music. I could not live without dance. I could not live without conversation. I could not live without wine.
Were these things, with the possible exception of wine, the marks of an educated man in your age?
Yes, they were. I would say that they were the marks of an educated man. In a sense, they were more the marks of a cultured man, because it's possible to be educated without being cultured. But I was fortunate. My father was a self-taught man. He had 40 or more books in his little library when the average household had none or 2. And when he died, he made it clear that his last request was that I be classically educated, and my guardian saw to it that I was. And then, unlike most Americans, I had the good fortune of going to France at a critical moment in my life, and there I really fell in love with culture. I did not know what music was until I was in the salons of Paris, or sculpture, or opera, or theater. And I, in a sense, became so enamored of European civilization that I brought as much of it back with me to Monticello and to the United States as I could. So I would say that privilege allowed me to be more fully cultured than most people are enabled to be, especially in a raw frontier country like ours.
If Tony will permit me another question, from your last answer, I take it that your father died when you were young?
I was 14. He was my hero. He was the strongest man I ever met and the most resourceful. It was his motto, never to allow anyone else to do something for you, never to put off anything till tomorrow, never spend your money before you have it. He had great resourcefulness, and he taught me the most important motto that any young man can ever learn. He said, in America, especially in America, we must never despair. It is amazing how much we can do if we are always doing. And his motto was nil desperandum. Nothing is to be despaired of. amongst a person and a country where there is resourcefulness.
And a quick related question, if I may. Your guardian, who was that person, and what impact did he have on your life?
Well, John Harvey was his name. There were actually several, but these guardians, after the death of my father, tried to fulfill his will, and they made it possible, for example, for me to go to the College of William and Mary at a time when most young people didn't go to college, and they really permitted me to chart my own course, so that I think I can honestly say that I was the most bookish American in American history. When I was a young man, I read between 10 and 15 hours a day, every day, day after day, week after week, year after year. Frankly, I doubt if I would have been able to do that had my father lived. He might have put a stop to that sort of intense reading regimen, but there was no one to supervise me. I was cast upon the world without anyone to help me except my memory of my father. And the way I solved that problem, and I think this is good advice for young people generally, is whenever I was in a critical moment, I asked myself, what would George Wythe do? What would Peyton Randolph do? What would William Small, my mentor, do? So I tried to have their souls looking over my shoulder at all times.
Thank you very much.
President Jefferson, as we are doing this series here in 1999, we've invited a number of very famous people that have contributed much as yourself from the last 1,000 years. And one of those individuals was the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who came sometime after you. And in his presentation prior to your arrival, he indicated that he thought the greatest accomplishment in this country, and maybe in the world, was the abolition of slavery during what we call the Civil War, in which the northern states, under the commander Abraham Lincoln as the president, defeated the South and restored the Union, but also had the abolition of slavery, which went through a progression in time. He indicated in that he was greatly influenced by your Declaration of Independence, which he thought was the greatest document that was politically written. Two parts. One, even though you own slaves, it's my understanding that you were troubled by that and would like to incorporate that in the Declaration of Independence. And how would you respond to President Lincoln's real compliment of your document, basically, that you wrote?
Well, first let me say that I didn't live to meet this man, the 16th president. I was the third president, and I died in 1826 when he would have been little more than a boy. I take his praise with great humility. I think that freeing the slaves was something that had to happen, and sooner rather than later. In my fragmentary autobiography, I said, nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that this people must and will be free. And frankly, I was ashamed that my own generation failed to do this act of justice. We should have used the moment of the revolution to get this over with once and for all. The longer you wait, the more difficult it is. And when slavery spread itself into the American West in the Missouri Compromise period, I said, this is the death knell of the nation. Now there will be a civil conflagration over this issue. So I praise him for doing that great act of national justice. On the other hand, I find fault with the 16th president for trying to hold the Union together with bloodshed. I believe in a compact theory of America, that every state is a sovereign nation. New Jersey is sovereign. Virginia is sovereign, just as Switzerland and France are sovereign in Europe, and that any state has a sacred right to secede at any time for any reason, and the Union cannot force a state to remain under my constitutional theory. So I find highly perplexing his view that blood should be the price of national union, and that the northern states have a right to invade the South to keep them in the social compact. But be that as it may, I do honestly believe, and I don't mean to call attention to myself, I do believe that the Emancipation Proclamation in its first draft was the Declaration of Independence. In other words, the little flame that we lit on the 4th of July, 1776, was intended and destined to engulf the world and free all subject peoples, some sooner and some later. And I see the Emancipation Proclamation as the next great step of extending the rights of man beyond what was possible within my own lifetime.
You made a statement when you appeared on our campus yesterday. It was most intriguing to me in relation to this issue. There was a committee for the drafting of the Declaration, but you really were the architect. It's mostly your language. And you indicated that those who were attending the Congress and were going to ratify the Declaration would not have given you this opportunity if they had thought it was going to have the significance it did. Would you like to explain? Is that just a modest statement on your part, Mr. President?
I don't think so. You know, it wasn't known until 1800 that I was the author of the Declaration of Independence. It was seen as a committee work, as a work of the Congress of the United States, and that's as it should be. It was a statement of the American intention to be free in the world's arena. And it doesn't matter who wrote it. What matters is that we articulated these great natural law principles. I do believe that John Adams was right when he said that I brought what he called a peculiar felicity for expression to the Declaration of Independence. In other words, it's more well written than it might have been in the hands of another, but all the thoughts in it are hackneyed. They're commonplaces of the human rights tradition. What I tried to do was state them in terms so compelling that every rational being would have to accept them as the truth. They are, I think, self-evident truths that man has rights in nature and that those rights don't disappear when he enters a society. But it is, I think, fair to say that if the men of the Continental Congress had known that the Declaration of Independence would go on to be the most famous document in the history of liberty, it would have gone to a more ambitious and a more prominent man, perhaps John Hancock or John Adams, who should have written it, Dr. Franklin, the greatest American. But I was relatively new to this business. I was not well known. I had not taken the lead in our revolutionary cause, and it was only really given to me because it was considered a minor state paper at the time.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
In our time, there's a lot of interest in what is going on in other countries, and we have relationships with other countries. You've spoken a little bit so far today about the relationships between the states and also the states to the Union. What, in your time, did you consider to be the relationship between countries, and particularly between the United States and other countries?
Well, it's good that you added that final provision, because I think there's a fundamental difference between the United States and all other countries in the world. For one thing, we have the great benefit of 3,000 miles of ocean between us and the havoc of the old world. I want no part of the old world. Its feudal systems, its superstitions, its institutions that cannot be understood or rationalized. This whole European culture teaches us only what bad government has been. And thank God we are separated by an ocean from that madness. I'm an isolationist. I believe that we should create a kind of utopian fortress here in the New World. After all, we have a continent to play with. And leave the old world to recover if it can. But that we should never interfere in other nations at any time for any purpose unless the very survival of this republic is at stake. And I said once, would the Atlantic Ocean were an ocean of fire?
But you accepted help from other countries when it was useful to the Union.
That may appear to be a serious contradiction, because we probably would not have been free, at least in the short run, without the help of France. And the strange thing about the French aid in the Revolution was that it had two unintended consequences for Louis XVI. First, it bankrupted his nation and brought on the French Revolution. And secondly, the very ideas that he helped to encourage, although he never believed in them, went on to revolutionize that culture in a really dramatic way, much more dramatic than our simpler little separation revolution in the United States. So if he had a chance to do it over again, I doubt very much that he would have sided with us in that war. He didn't do it because he was an idealist or a Republican. He did it because he hated Great Britain. But I say thank you, Louis XVI. We do not return the favor.
Did you have some part to play in getting his cooperation?
Well, in an indirect sense. The Declaration of Independence really opened the door to the French alliance. No one was going to recognize us until we declared our independency and stated our national goals. And so the Declaration was intended in part to see which European powers might wish to recognize us and to give us help. But really, all of the credit for that goes to Dr. Franklin. We would not have had a French alliance without Benjamin Franklin. I consider him the greatest man of the 18th century on either side of the Atlantic. Think of it, self-taught, a natural rather than a pseudo-aristocrat, born in obscurity. He rose to be one of the great scientists in world history and one of its finest diplomats. And his suavity almost single-handedly brought us the French aid that really brought the revolution to an early close.
Mr. President, you said that you didn't agree with President Lincoln's use of force to maintain the Union, and you also mentioned that you were an isolationist, and yet, as you know from your travels to our age, that the United States is hardly isolationist today. Are there other changes you see today that are particularly at odds with your philosophy of government?
Well, let me say, without intending to sound sarcastic or judgmental, that you have strayed so fundamentally from my vision that you cannot in any meaningful sense call yourself a Jeffersonian culture any longer. I have no quarrel with this. It does me no injury if you wish to pursue some other vision. But it's frankly not what I intended. I wanted a simple, decentralized, lightly governed, lightly taxed agrarian paradise. And you have become an urban, industrial, militaristic giant. This is not, I think, what most of the Founding Fathers had in mind. Perhaps Hamilton would admire your world. But you have prosperity and security that no nation has ever enjoyed. I have no quarrel with your choices, but I will tell you this. The pursuit of happiness, in my historical opinion, is not equally served by empire as it was by an agrarian republic.
How did you feel about the expansion of the borders of the United States, even that expansion that occurred during your lifetime?
Well, first
was
of all,
that a step toward in the direction that you've just talked about a moment ago?
Some historians believe that I inadvertently helped to bring about empire and destroy the republic by buying the Louisiana Territory from Bonaparte. I do not agree. I do not think there's any practical limit to the extent of a republic. Montesquieu, I think, was wrong on that question. But I doubled the size of the United States with a single stroke of the pen in 1803, and I was, I must say, an ardent expansionist. I said to Mr. Madison every time there was a war scare with Britain, let's just go invade Canada and get it over with. I wanted Canada. I also wanted Cuba, but I know no more than that. I said, let us place a cairn at the bottommost tip of Cuba, and on that cairn write in Latin, ne plus ultra, thus far and no farther. So my empire for liberty, as I like to call it, would have extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the North Pole to the bottommost tip of Cuba, but no farther.
You said earlier that you learned culture in Paris, and yet you have no regard for their government. What strikes you about the difference between obviously intelligent and cultured people and very poor government? What did you learn from that experience?
Well, first of all, in France I learned that Voltaire was right when he said, in Europe every man is either the hammer or the anvil. If the cost of opera is a hierarchical society in which the average man is ground to powder by a tyrannical government and by aristocracy and a wicked, superstitious church, then I prefer folk culture and freedom. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a middle ground, but I do believe that the United States should preserve its innocence even if that keeps us culturally naive. We can, after all, go to Europe on holiday. We can import the best books and the best wines from Europe, but I think we should let our workshops remain in Europe, and I think we should avoid becoming cultured to the point of decadence. And if urbanity, if industrial urbanity is the basis for high culture, I don't want it. I would prefer to eat my cabbage and read my simple American poetry.
And if I may have one more question along a similar line, what did you think of the France that emerged after the French Revolution? What were your thoughts on what happened there?
Well, I think that France went too far too fast. I wanted France to consolidate after the first phase of its revolution, perhaps to create a constitutional monarchy of the British sort, and to educate and work reforms and then move to the next level a generation or two later. But if you move a people who have been treated abysmally, ground to powder for millennia, if you move them too far too fast, I think it invites reaction and military dictatorship. And I frankly was not surprised to see the Attila of my age, Bonaparte, come to power in France. What a terrible end to an idealistic movement. But, once revolutions start, there's no stopping them. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. And when the people finally regain their long-lost rights, they don't do it politely.
Thank you.
Mr. President, because of your intellect and your reading and your interest, you were able to observe or have information from most of the second millennium, with the exception of 173 years of that 1,000. But yet again, as you come back to visit, you have been briefed on that. Based upon the fact that we're ending the second millennium very soon, what is your reaction to that 1,000 years? As someone who is very visionary and very interested in history, would you react to the last 1,000 years?
Well, in the year 1000, we were still a medieval, backward-looking, ignorant, superstitious culture where people weren't even able to feed themselves. Science played no significant role in the life of man. When I died in 1826, we were the most progressive people who had ever lived on Earth. We had brought the Enlightenment to its flowering until every human being was treated with dignity. Even slaves were beginning to see the amelioration of their condition. So there is no doubt that this progress from the year 1000 towards the year 2000 has been the greatest single millennium in human history. I think mankind is regaining his long-lost liberties. Unfortunately, there is an ocean of blood still to be spilled before that great flowering is complete. But we did more to make it possible for more people to live in circumstances of decency and political dignity than any other generation that ever lived on Earth. And moreover, we skipped over the abysmal architecture and culture of the Middle Ages and got back to the neoclassical world of the Parthenon and the Maison Curie and the Pantheon of Rome. So we re-established neoclassical values in my time. No, if you had to live in any century other than your own, you would want to have lived in the late 18th.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
In our time, you're quite a hero, President Jefferson, but in your time, you had some critics, and some of those critics were political enemies as well. Can you tell us who you consider to be some of your harshest critics?
Well, I can name two, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall. Now, let me say that I never lost a friend deliberately. I was friendly to everyone. Conflict is no part of my character. I'm a harmony obsessive. I tried to adopt artificial good humor, even when I didn't feel it naturally. And I was polite to Hamilton and polite to Marshall in social circles. But I actually think both of them are very dangerous men who were destroying the very dream that we were trying to install in this country. So what can I say of them? I think conservatives, generally speaking, are hypochondriacs, melancholy men, pessimists, people of diseased minds and diseased bodies who can't see the goodness of man. And because they can't, they don't want to extend your rights to you or yours to you. So I think healthy, cheerful, well-adjusted beings are always Republicans. And people of corrupt souls are inevitably Federalists.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. Mr. President, on behalf of our panel and our staff, it's been such an honor to have you to visit our time as the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity to thank the Idaho Humanities Council for this wonderful grant again this year that's making this series possible. They've been very generous to us over the past 4 years, and they would join me in saying that Dr. Clay Jenkinson is the great Chautauqua performer, and we thank them for allowing him, through their funding, to be here with us. It has just simply been a great pleasure. I want to say to you that we are going to continue this series. It's a very long series, but that is good because there's so many famous people in the last 1,000 years that have contributed so much to where you are today. And we must go back in history to find our roots and to know where we're at and where we'll be going in the future. And therefore, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we will yet examine a number of people in history as we have a panel of some very well-known and famous people from different centuries over the past 1,000 years. And please be with us at that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.